Welcome to TechCom. And today I want to talk to you about what could be used to revive the Terminator franchise, a Terminator survival horror video game. Now, as I was browsing through Terminator content, I recently stumbled upon this particular image of a Terminator being aimed at by a pistol with only 4 rounds, and the title, Terminator Survival Horror, written on it. And then I looked and saw that the article was at least a few years old, and while it is old, I felt it should get some light shined upon it. Now then, on to the article. This article was found on Game Rant, written by Shane Michael O'Gorman, published April 19th, 2021. Okay, so that's not too old, just about a year behind. The next Terminator game should be more survival horror, less action-based. The Terminator is no stranger to video games, but a future effort should look to the horror themes of the original film for inspiration. There are those who would argue that the Terminator franchise in itself should also be terminated, after a string of subpar sequel films. Whether it's a bland narrative, mediocre action, or dry performances, these follow-ups always seem to fall short in comparison to the incredible bar set by the first 2 movies. At the same time, the Terminator storyline is a compelling one, with humanity's last stand against a menacing machine in a war-torn future can make for thrilling and engaging content. The franchise can continue to live on in other mediums, such as the recently announced Terminator Netflix series, and even in the form of video games. As fun as it may be to smash these metal mother truckers into junk, adapting the Terminator into an action game may be a bit too obvious. The movies have been chasing the scale of Terminator 2 Judgment Day for years, and the recent Terminator Resistance also tried to replicate the excitement of other first-person shooters, but set within the Terminator world. The solution for a compelling Terminator game may be to examine the first movie's horror slasher themes in an attempt to deliver a far more tense experience, not far from what is seen in the survival horror genre. The Terminator can't be reasoned with. The Terminator is a terrifying sci-fi icon due to its commitment to hunting down a target and practically being close to impossible to destroy without the weapons of the future. To return to the aforementioned first Terminator film released in 1984, much of the suspense was attributed to how Sarah Connor and Kyle Reese were massively outmatched by the T-800, as the weapons available were essentially useless and would only slow down the Terminator at best. A shotgun blast would merely stagger it, or a direct hit from a car would only cause it to stumble, and a blaze of fire would serve no more than a minor nuisance to it. With all of this in mind, how much more exhilarating would it be for the player to be hunted by one Terminator that can't be killed, with the main objective being to hide or escape? As stated, blowing these robots away with high-tech weapons is fun, but after a while, the thrill may subside and devolve into repetition. Why not allow a developer to take full advantage of the destructive potential of a T-800 and make it the single scary obstacle in a focused survival horror experience? A fellow sci-fi franchise had a similar treatment in 2014 with Alien Isolation, ditching the more action-focused approach of Alien's colonial marines. This much slower and intense experience was a fresh spin on the brand's video games, taking full advantage of the monstrous xenomorph and its abilities as a stalker and imposing foe. A T-800 is just as relentless and brutal in its methods as a killing machine, qualities which aren't far off from established video game antagonists like Mr. X in Resident Evil 2. Run or hide. Speaking of the Resident Evil franchise, its recent entries have placed an emphasis on a less is more philosophy, resulting in fewer opponents that pose a more formidable threat. In Resident Evil 7, aside from the mold creatures, the Baker family serve as the only physical opposition to the player, with traditional weapons doing very little outside of scripted battles. The only option in these scenarios is to run or hide, as direct combat will certainly lead to failure against an otherwise unstoppable enemy. A similar approach can be taken with how a player interacts with the T-800, making items and weapons only capable of slowing the metallic menace down to provide a few split seconds to run away. Of course, this in itself could become a repetitive gameplay loop if stretched out too long, as a single enemy can only be entertaining for so much of the game's overall length. Perhaps restricting the game to one location like the hospital in Outlast, with the very simple goal being to get out, would help balance the experience to keep it short but sweet. Exploration would be a dangerous venture considering the Terminator is always on the prowl, but a necessary act in order to gather resources. It's that sense of anxiety for these risks that make survival horror games so engaging for gamers. All in all, the Terminator franchise has been proven to work exceptionally well in the action genre, with countless efforts in movies, comics, shows, and games. But it's the darker noir horror inspirations of the 1984 original that remains rife with potential and completely untapped for the series as a whole. Make the T-800 a threat again. Remind players why this pop culture icon is such a terrifying force to be reckoned with. A survival horror game based on the series would surely revive these long-forgotten feelings of fear the franchise once invoked. This sensation would surely return as players walk slowly down a dimly lit hallway, only to hear the whirring motors and spinning gears of the Terminator just around the corner. Now, with having read that, I have to give my own opinion. Not only does that article practically voice my thoughts on how the Terminator franchise should go about, but there are also some other ideas to consider. The idea of being trapped in a building like a hospital or a factory or any kind of building, and then having to escape, it would definitely invoke vibes of Alien Isolation, as well as Resident Evil 2, with how Mr. X is pretty much stalking you the whole time. Heck, despite how underwhelming it was, even Nemesis, when he was stalking you during the unscripted moments, would be good. And if they either do a sequel or another Terminator is added into the mix like the T-1000, it could make it even more terrifying. I mean, just imagine a Terminator video game along the lines of Alien Isolation and the Resident Evil games. That would be a horrifying way to go. So that's pretty much what I've been saying the whole time, trying to get the Terminator franchise back to its B-movie sci-fi horror roots. But until Hollywood gets their head out of their ass and decides to actually go back to tradition with its movie making, perhaps a video game is more what we need. Heck, I would personally hire the developers of Alien Isolation to actually make this Terminator horror game. Given how good they handled the Alien Isolation game, they would definitely be the right people for the job with a Terminator survival horror game. Who knows, maybe even Sega can team up with Capcom, combine the elements of the RE engine with how Nemesis and Mr. X stalked you, with how the alien was stalking you in Alien Isolation. It'll definitely make for an awesome-ass game. Of course, we don't want it to be so terrifying where you can barely accomplish your objectives like in Alien Isolation. You do need moments where you do actually need to take shots at the Terminator. With all that said and done, be sure to shoot the like button as it helps the channel grow, and terminate that subscribe button, and be sure to ring the bell for notifications to stay notified.
Come with me if you want to live.
There is no fate but what we make for ourselves.
Thanks for your cooperation.
I'll be back.
Hasta la vista, baby.
This is TechCom, preserving Terminator lore since 1984. Follow us if you want to live. Remember, there is no fate but what we make.